O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls, O good one. Amen. So what I want to do is go through the first part of this chapter, and the first 10, and then maybe into a story or two, because it's basically an introduction, then a bunch of stories, and then compare a little bit from Saint Ignaty Brianchaninov, the arena, because the kind of obedience that's talked about in the ladder is different than the kind of obedience that really is practiced and really is appropriate for our day. So, with that, Basarin, you want to read?
Our treatise now appropriately touches upon warriors and athletes of Christ. As the flower precedes the fruit, so exile, either of body or will, always precedes obedience. For with the help of these two virtues, the holy soul steadily ascends to heaven as upon golden wings. And perhaps it was about this that he who had received the Holy Spirit sang, "Who will give me wings like a dove, and I will fly by activity and be at rest by divine vision and humility."
So just to note, this is specifically aimed at monks. When he talks about warriors and athletes of Christ, he's talking about ascetics, and which specifically would mean monks. Not that people are living in the world are not ascetics and warriors of Christ, they are, but he's talking about specifically the monastic context, and more specifically about life in a skeet, actually. In other words, close discipleship to an elder. So, keep going.
But let us not fail, if you agree, to describe clearly in our treatise the weapons of these brave warriors, how they hold the shield of faith in God and their trainer, and with it they ward off, so to speak, every thought of unbelief and change of place, how they constantly raise the drawn sword of the Spirit and slay every wish of their own that approaches them, how, clad in the iron armor of meekness and patience, they avert every insult and injury and missile. And for a helmet of salvation they have the superior's protection through prayer. And they do not stand with their feet together, for one is stretched out in service and the other is immovable in prayer. Obedience is absolute renunciation of our own life, clearly expressed in our bodily actions, or conversely, obedience is the mortification of the limbs while the mind remains alive. Obedience is unquestioning movement, voluntary death, a life free of curiosity, carefree danger, unprepared defense before God, fearlessness of death, a safe voyage, a sleeper's progress. Obedience is the tomb of the will and the resurrection of humility. A corpse does not argue or reason as to what is good or what seems to be bad. For he who has devoutly put the soul of the novice to death will answer for everything. Obedience is an abandonment of discernment and a wealth of discernment. The beginning of the mortification both of the soul's desire and of the bodily members is much hard work. The middle is sometimes laborious and sometimes not laborious, but the end is insensibility and insusceptibility to toil and pain. Only when he sees himself doing his own will does this blessed living corpse feel sorry and sick at heart, and he fears the responsibility of using his own judgment.
Okay, so from this, it's pretty clear that what he's talking about is absolute unquestioning obedience. And in other words, the total renunciation of will. Now, this is something that is not easily achieved, and it's something that takes a long time to enter into. And in fact, this can only exist in a very specific context, and we'll get into that later. But it's interesting to see what he's talking about, and because it's what he really is talking about is absolute, unquestioning, unthinking obedience, in which the spiritual father takes complete responsibility for all of the actions of the monks under him, and we'll get into that later. Okay, yeah.
I was just wondering what it meant on section 3 by unprepared defense before God.
In other words, if he's truly obedient, he doesn't have to present a defense before God. It's completely in the hands of his spiritual father.
Okay.
Near the top of 69, the first paragraph, last sentence. Obedience is an abandonment of discernment in a wealth of discernment. It seems to, the language just seems paradoxical. I don't
Well, it is, and there's a lot of paradox used in this book, and there's a certain school of obedience in which the novice simply does what the superior says, period, without judging it, without discerning. So, if he tells you to plant the dahlias in front of the marigolds, and the I don't know, and the bushes in front of those, you just do it. You don't say no, because the marigolds are small and the dahlias are a little bit bigger, and then you have the bushes and it creates a nice hedge, and no, you do what he said, and so in some ways it sounds like foolishness, and there is an aspect of that. And part of that is training the novice to do it regardless of whether it makes sense or not, because ultimately the spiritual father has something else in mind besides how the dahlias and the marigolds are going to go together. So, okay.
You that have decided to strip for the arena of the spiritual confession, you that wish to take on your neck the yoke of Christ, you that are therefore trying to lay your own burden on another's shoulders, you that are hastening to sign a pledge that you are voluntarily surrendering yourself to slavery, and in return want freedom written to your account, you that are being supported by the hands of others as you swim across this great sea, you should know that you have decided to travel by a short but rough way from which there is only one erring path, and it is called self-rule. But he who has renounced this entirely, even in things that seem to be good and spiritual and pleasing to God, has reached the end before setting out on his journey. For obedience is distrust of oneself in everything, however good it may be, right to the end of one's life.
And that's very important, to build distrust of oneself and of one's own will, and not to. And this is why, for example, there's no discussion. In a good, well-ordered monastery, there's no discussion of politics. There's no discussion of church politics. There's no discussion of contemporary issues. The novices are not encouraged to even to hear or see anything about that stuff. In other words, no internet, no newspapers, no TV, nothing of that. And that's very important, because what does all that do? Is it encourages us to either make our own opinion, or to accept others' opinions, or to fall into all sorts of controversial topics and things like that, and it's extremely unhealthy spiritually, because it's if the idea is simply to become single-minded, to achieve inner quiet, inner stillness, and if you're thinking about all of this, the politics and all of this other nonsense, you're not going to have any. Plus, if you're continually evaluating whether what the superior tells you makes sense or not, or whether you like it or not, or if you don't like it, why you don't like it, and that leads to why you don't like him, and on and on and on and on, until finally you thought yourself out of the monastery. So that's even if it's not a context of absolute unquestioning obedience, it's very important to the novices especially do not subject themselves to having to make take all these positions on all of these political nonsense and things like that. In other words, it's an abandonment of discernment, which in turn is a wealth of discernment, because it's a very discerning thing to abandon all of that stuff and realize that it's all nonsense. So, yeah.
Is there a level we can try to emulate this in the world?
No. No, I mean it's well, in the world, yeah. I mean so far as a life of obedience in the world, no, that's not possible.
Yeah.
But so far as cutting out undue influences, yeah, that can be.
Okay.
But still, you need to, if you're living in the world, you probably need to have an idea, you have to have some idea of what's going on. So you can't live as a monk in the world. It doesn't work. Certainly the relationship of obedience does not work. And also, and that's the context for this whole kind of spirituality. So if you're going to be in the world, you're going to be in the world, and don't expect to live like a monk in the world. Another thing that's really critically important along those lines is, and this all comes into the whole practice of confession of thoughts. This presumes that a monk has the elder very frequently available, like on a daily basis, to hear their thoughts. And that doesn't mean that the elder needs to 24/7 be just waiting for the disciple to come and say, oh, I've got this thought, I've got that thought, I'm thinking, I want to do this, I want to do. No, but that kind of confession of thoughts, it only works in a close discipleship context, and that's not possible in the world, because the monastery is a hothouse for that. So. But another thing and this is important, even though and this in particular, is about unthinking obedience. It's about obedience, but it's not about control. And that's and there's a very important distinction there. Because this is about the disciples' attitude of obedience. But it's not about the attitude of the superior wanting to control somebody's life. And because one of the things you learn in this business, as it were, is that you can't control anybody. And you can't try. But obedience is not about control. Obedience is about learning self-denial. And that's the essence of self-denial, is obedience. So self-control is control would be from the side of the one giving the obedience, but obedience is from the side of the disciple. And so when you get priests, lay priests, like parish priests, who are controlling and all of that, that's absolutely wrong. It's categorically, and in fact, it usually often leads to something immoral, actually, because it's not. You can't. It has nothing to do with control. And those parish priests, we had big problems with that in the Orthodox Church in this country of, especially of converts from evangelicalism, where they had this shepherding movement from the 70s and 80s, and so the parish priest thought, well, yesterday he was Pastor Billy Bob, today he's Archpriest Barsanuphius, and he's gone from being a foursquare pastor to a presbyter. And if he's a presbyter, that means he's an elder. And if he's an elder, that means he's a starets. And if he's a starets, that means he has to have absolute control over everyone and everything in his domain. This is the path of delusion. So in some of these convert parishes, you would get people asking the priest what color they could paint their living room, what kind of car they should buy, what brand of toilet paper they should have, when and how they could have sex, and on and on and on and on and on. And really, this just became a sick and abusive situation. And
asking for the blessing every time you move.
Right. And in a monastery, you can do that, but not in a parish. And part of the thing is that has to be the that's only in a monastic context of obedience, and it's certainly not for some idiot, some new priest who has read a book or two.
Is there any way that that's sort of managed in the monastery? I mean, are there examples that it gets out of hand in a monastery as well?
Oh yeah, it can. And it's when it becomes a personality cult.
Okay.
Because those parishes were personality cults. There was one parish that I knew, because a friend of mine went in to take over from the priest who had to be removed, who had, was this, miracle wonder boy who'd gone from Archpriest to, Pastor Billy Bob to Archpriest Barsanuphius and so forth. And so he got in there, and the parish had not permitted any kind of regular clergy to, have a say or even closely examine the life of the community or the bishop. And so this other priest, who was kind of, just normal, well-educated Orthodox priest, went in there and he found out the parish wasn't incorporated. Well, it had been there a long time, and he found out eventually that there was a rather substantial flow of cash. And part of that flow of cash was because the priest demanded that everybody tithe. And he made sure that they tithed because he demanded to see their tax returns. And they couldn't be members unless they gave a straight 10% off the top. Now, the parish wasn't incorporated. What bank account do you think that all of that money went into when you had all of these yuppie families who were earning 6 figures and tithing on that? Him personally. It was his personal account. Big problems. Big problem. So, anyway. Thank God, that era has kind of passed. But the danger remains especially with uneducated clergy. Unfortunately, Roquefort has a lot of uneducated clergy, and some of them are very good, and some of them are, need to be educated. So, anyway, that's my little tirade.
When motives of humility and real longing for salvation incite us to bend our neck and entrust ourselves to another in the Lord, before entering upon this life, if there is any cleverness and prudence in us, we ought first to question and examine, and even, so to speak, test our helmsman, so as not to mistake the sailor for the pilot, a sick man for a doctor, a passionate for a dispassionate man, the sea for a harbor, and so to bring about the speedy shipwreck of our soul. But when once we have entered the arena of piety and obedience, we must no longer judge our good manager in any way at all, even though we may perhaps see in him some slight failings, since he is only human. Otherwise, by sitting in judgment, we shall get no profit from our subjection.
This is a very important thing. You don't judge your spiritual father. You don't criticize him. You just you give thanks to God for him. You pray for him. Of course, he's got shortcomings. If he does something illegal or immoral, that's a different issue. Then you need to take that to a superior. But it's very important because it destroys the whole relationship of obedience. Because it's based on a relationship of love and cooperation and respect. And how are you respecting somebody if you're judging and criticizing and condemning them? So, but it is important, first off, to see whether this person is the right person that you trust and are willing to go into a relationship of spiritual guidance with.
Right.
So, it doesn't have to be a glow-in-the-dark elder, because they wouldn't know what. In the first place, you wouldn't know what to do with them, and they probably really wouldn't know what to do with you because as one of the great fathers said, it's not so much that there are just no great elders left, it's that there are no real disciples. That's the problem. Because we in our culture have no idea, have no clue how to be a real disciple. In the Russian Orthodox Church, in the monastic life, the eldership, or being a spiritual father, in the Greek Church too, being a spiritual father is an obedience. And just because somebody's a priest or a priest monk, even a very senior priest monk, that doesn't mean they have the blessing of the church and of their superior, of their bishop or of their abbot, to be a spiritual father. It's a unique calling, and some people are gifted with those skills and those gifts by God in order to be able to deal with people, and other people are not. And it's up to the bishop and the abbot to discern whether a person will is able to direct souls, or whether he's going to lead them into perdition. And that's a very important important thing, because there's a lot of people out there who want to be elders and things like that, but the church hasn't blessed it, and some of them the church would never bless. Even those that have the title of elder, and some who are elders in that sense are still not blessed to hear confessions of the laity. Yeah.
That was my question. So, if a priest is blessed to to be a confessor, is he would he be a guide, a spiritual father?
It depends. The Greek system is a little different than the Russian system, but not all parish and it differs between a monastery and relationship within a monastery, and the relationship of in the Greek Church they have these traveling confessors. There's one or two hieromonks in a diocese that will be blessed to hear confessions, and most priests were not blessed to hear confessions. They were forbidden from hearing confessions. And in fact, in the Church of Greece, they had a situation where most of the clergy were barely literate. They were just pious men who loved the services, and so they were forbidden to preach with their own words. They were given sermons to read, if they could read them, and the confessor, these priest monks would go from parish to parish throughout the year, hearing the confessions of the laity. In a monastery, you've got a number of different kinds of levels. In the Russian practice, there are priest monks in a monastery, a large monastery, who are not blessed to hear confessions. Then there are those who are blessed to hear the confessions of the laity. But few and far between are the priest monks who are blessed to be the spiritual fathers of the brethren of the monastery, because that usually belongs to the abbot, and to the few people that he assigns to that task, if there are too many. It's yet another step before a priest monk is given the blessing to build a community of disciples. That's another entire other step. And for example, start his own skeet. Although he still would be accountable to the abbot of the monastery. But the basic point of the Athonite style, wherever it's used, is that the abbot is the ultimate spiritual father of the monastery. Yeah.
In a ski, how does that system work with confession if there's only two of them?
Well, there's usually, if one of them has the blessing to be a spiritual father and take disciples, then the other one goes to him for confession. But the spiritual father would probably go to the abbot for confession. In the Russian church, skeets can be very large. They can turn this on. You can have 30, 40, 50 people in a skeet. Most of the monasteries on Mount Athos are smaller than that, actually. There's only a couple large ones. But the point is that you have the abbot, who's the elder, the star, and then you also have the startsi, the starets, which means elder. For example, at Trinity Saint, at the big monasteries, the big lavras in Russia, there'll be several priest monks, usually very elderly, who are blessed to be elders, to have the ministry of a starets, and that is to receive people and to hear their confessions and to both monks and lay. But here again, it's a very specific blessing in a very specific context. Not just somebody who's dressed up, and certainly not somebody who was Pastor Billy Bob last week for the Assembly of God. Some of these are real cases, So, any other questions? Yeah.
Do the Greeks still follow that system in Greece, that not all parish priests regularly give confessions, that
I believe they do.
they send around confessors from...
Yeah, there's usually one confessor or more designated per diocese. Depends on how large the diocese is.
And in Cyprus, is it...
Probably the same situation. Though some people will have spiritual fathers in monasteries, and they'll go to them.
And what is the thinking? I mean, I understand if there's not literate people, educated men, but it's the thinking that it's better to have people from the monastic...
Well, people who've been formed in the monastic life they may not have a formal seminary education, but they've certainly received a very intense education in spiritual matters. Hopefully. My guess is that actually a lot of the confessors probably also have a strong seminary education, or theological education.
Is there some thinking they want to keep not have the parish priests involved with hearing the confessions because they have to deal with these people all the time, or is it... No, that's not a problem. It's just that that all comes from the whole Ottoman period, where where there was no theological education in the Greek world. And so the only people that were available, unless they'd been sent off to theological education in the West someplace, were, the pious laity. And so they'd pick, somebody who probably had a good voice and who could sing the service and read enough of the text so that he could get through the service. And, but who was probably also a farmer like everybody else in the village. Of course, that's changed as Greece has become very, modernized. But so I don't know
exactly the practice of the Greek Church, but that's how I understand it.
There's certainly less going to confession.
Yeah. Oh, in Greek parishes, yeah. In America too, in the Greek Archdiocese, precisely because of this, that parish priests were generally forbidden to hear confessions. People got out of the habit of going to confession, and so they would go to confession once a year, maybe, hopefully. Although in my first parish, I had a lady. She was 75 years old, and she was from one of these big Greek communities in New Hampshire. And I was talking about confession in the parish, and went to visit her, and she said, "I'm 75 years old. I've been going to communion every Sunday since I was baptized as an infant, and I've never been to confession, and I'm not about to start now." Eventually, she did that. But the Russian Orthodox practice, where we have a very strong emphasis on frequent confession, it's I personally think it's a healthier practice. So spiritually healthier, much healthier, and that's also because of the permeation of the whole monastic ideal within the Russian Orthodox community, whereas a lot of the Greek communities were more secularized.
Well, we were also looking at parish versus monasteries. So at St. Anthony's Greek Orthodox Monastery, there's a lot of confession.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, the monasteries are great. Yeah. And Elder Ephraim, when Elder Ephraim first came to America, he actually came as part of Rokor. Because he had spiritual children here, and the Greek Archdiocese was absolutely death on monasticism, and so he wanted to make sure that his spiritual children were well served, and he came to Canada and he came to America and he heard confessions and was just appalled at what was going on in the Greek Archdiocese, and he got called back to Mount Athos. He got called to the carpet for having gone into Rokor. But eventually he came back, and his whole vision was based on correcting the abuses in the Greek Archdiocese. He said, the Russians, they have all their monasteries, and the Serbs have monasteries, and why don't the Greeks have any monasteries? So we need to have Greek monasteries in America. The Russians go to confession and the Serbs go to confession, but our Greek people aren't going to confession. So we need to be able to provide places for people to go to confession and to experience normal Orthodox piety. So and so that's 20 monasteries later. It's pretty remarkable. Anyway, back to, what is it, 7?
Yes. It is absolutely indispensable for those of us who wish to retain undoubting faith in our superiors to write their good deeds indelibly in our hearts and constantly remember them, so that when the demons sow among us lack of faith in them, we may be able to silence them by what is preserved in our memory. For the more faith flourishes in the heart, the more alacrity the body has in service. But he who has stumbled on distrust has already fallen, for all that does not spring from faith is sin. The moment any thought of judging or condemning your superior occurs to you, leap away from it as from fornication. Whatever you do, give that snake no license, no place, no entry, no power, but say to that serpent, "Listen, deceiver, I have no authority to judge my superior, but he has been appointed to sit in judgment on me. It is not I who am to be his judge, but he is disputed to be mine." Deputed to be mine. The fathers have laid down that psalmody is a weapon, and prayer is a wall, and honest tears are a bath. But blessed obedience in their judgment is confession of faith, without which no one subject to passions will see the Lord. He who submits himself passes sentence on himself. If his obedience for the Lord's sake is perfect, even if it does not seem perfect, he will escape judgment. But if he does his own will in some things, then although he considers himself obedient, he lays the burden on his own shoulders. It is good if the superior does not cease reproving him, but if he is silent, then I do not know what to say. Those who submit themselves in the Lord in simplicity run the good race without provoking the cunning of the demons against themselves by their exacting investigations. First of all, let us make our confession to our good judge, and to him alone. But if he orders, then to all. Wounds displayed in public will not grow worse, but will be healed.
Okay. So, any questions on that? Yeah, it's a very important principle in the spiritual life that you don't judge your spiritual father, you don't judge your superior, and if you do fall into it, it destroys trust, and it's a whole relationship based on trust. Now, okay. And now for something a little different. Chapter 12 of this. This is a reading from the Arena by Saint Ignaty Brianchaninov, and there's a few things to know about this. He deals with a lot of similar topics, as does Saint John of the Ladder, but he wrote in the 19th century, and obviously he was in Russia, and wrote in the context of Russian monasticism. Now, there's a few things to remember about Russian monasticism in the 19th century. We have this, this idealized monasticism, idea of monasticism from the 7th century when the Ladder was originally written. By the 19th century, you have to remember that the Russian Church was a massive institution which was subjected to the state, which was subjected to endless amounts of imperial interference and control, which was subjected to a lay, the whole church was subjected to a lay official of the imperial government called an Oberprocurator, who essentially took the place of the patriarch. It was a very broken and corrupt system that was put in place for the duration of the whole Romanov dynasty, and which the church was unable to throw off until after the abdication of Nicholas II. And it's not that St. Nicholas II necessarily supported it as a corrupt system, but he was essentially stuck with it, because that was how the church was restructured under Peter I. In the monastic world, we don't refer to him as Peter the Great, because he was the first great persecutor of monasticism in Russia. Catherine, the so-called Great, the second, was another major persecutor of monasticism in Russia and of Orthodoxy. And so, from the monastic point of view, you have a rather different perspective on some of these historical figures. And one of the things that happened in the late 18th and 19th centuries is that, and if you read through the Arena, he he refers to state-supported monasteries and, you know, and all of that. Well, monasticism came under very heavy regulation. In the first place, the state confiscated the properties of the monasteries. The properties of the monasteries were their income. And so the monasteries were subjected to state control because they put all of the members of the monastic community, and it was highly regulated who could become a member of the monastic community and who could not. You basically had to be over 40. You couldn't join as a young person. Young people were highly discouraged or forbidden, and according to the ranks of seniority and of, you know, what level of monastic rank you held, you received a salary from the state in relationship to the equivalent rank in the military. So, a novice might receive the salary of a new recruit. A priest monk would maybe receive the salary of a lieutenant. An abbot might receive the salary of a captain, and so forth. And so all of a sudden, you had monastics, under the system, you had the whole system of monastic community in which nobody owned anything personally and everything was held communally. That whole thing was abolished, which is the essence of monastic economy, as it were. And you had this crazy system superimposed, just as it was also imposed on the lay clergy, the married clergy. So, for example, in the married clergy, there were 18 ranks. Starting with probably readers and prosphora-bakers and exorcists and subdeacons and deacon, simple deacon, a proto-deacon, archdeacon, which is the bishop's deacon, hierodeacon, monastic archdeacon, and on and on and on. And they all had their symbols of rank. So, of which we still have. When a priest is ordained in the Russian Church, he gets a silver 8-point cross, right? 3-bar cross. When he becomes when he gets a little higher, he can wear a gold cross, which is a gold Latin cross, right? Simple Latin cross. He gets to the next rank, he has a jeweled cross. He gets to the rank, a rank beyond that, he gets, things to hang on, vestments, the palitsa, the kind of...
The shield.
What's that?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's called a palitsa. There's no English equivalent. And all of that, and then there's a mitre, and then one of the highest ranks, Father Victor has, is double cross, and a mitre. And it's like that's as high as you can get in the ranks of the married priesthood. And then you had the bishops and all the levels of within the bishops. So you had a vicar bishop who was or a new guy who was a vicar bishop, and that was the lowest level. And then there would be a small diocesan bishop, and then there would be an archbishop, and then there would be a metropolitan, and then there would be a senior metropolitan on the synod, and then there would be the patriarch, and so these were like equivalent to the generals. 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star. It worked in the Russian Church for somehow, but it really stressed the nature of monastic life. Yeah.
Does the term church militant precede this sort of organization?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's Latin medieval. But it is a very military model. So in monasticism, so much of the internal structure of the monastery was totally messed up by the state in the Russian Church. The other thing that happened in starting in the late 18th century and into the 19th century was the reintroduction of the office of the elder, and with it the concept of obedience and of discipleship. All of this had gone by the wayside in the 18th century because of Peter and Catherine and all of their messing with the institution of monasticism. And because it's not just the restoration of eldership in the monastic life that happened as a result of the translation and publication of the Philokalia, it was also the restoration of discipleship, which is because you have to have the one to have the other. Now this was extremely controversial in the Russian Church, and only about 10% of the monasteries were actually reformed according to the traditional model, with the restoration of eldership and discipleship. And so Valam, Optina, the other places where there were great elders, Kiev Caves, Trinity St. Sergius, and then various hermitages, Glinsk Hermitage, and so forth. These were among the kind of
But take that.
These were among the communities that were the most influenced. Up until this time, there was a type of a form of life that was monastic life, which was commonly used, and it was called idiorhythmia. Now, if you look at your notes, note number 4, you should know that, let's see, you should know that you have decided to travel by a short but rough way from which there is only one erring path, and it is called self-rule. It's right in the middle of the page in paragraph 5. Well, self-rule is idiorhythmia. And this was how most of the Russian monasteries existed. They also had there was a lot of rough external asceticism. It was also heavily Latinized. And the Holy Mountain was the same thing. Rough external asceticism, lots of prostrations, wearing chains, beating yourself, all sorts of kind of penances that came out of the Latin Church. Because the Orthodox Church went through a whole period of intense Latinization from the 16th through the 19th centuries. all theology, for example, was always only taught in Latin during those periods, both in the Russian and the Greek churches. Yeah.
How did that happen?
It's called conquest.
Is that the origin of the Old Believer Schism?
No. Old Believer Schism came as a result of the church beginning to try and recover its traditional. You're beginning to try and recover because the leaders of the church recognized that there were big differences between what the Greeks were doing and what they were doing in Russia. And of course, everything was hand copied. This was printed service books were not real big at the time. And when things are hand copied, there's all sorts of errors that creep in. And so the Tsar insisted that the service books be corrected to the contemporary Greek version. And the practice of the Russian Church conformed to the contemporary Greek version. And that created a lot of problems. Then, a little bit later, there was this was all in the 17th century. There was going on actually from the late 16th century. You had the impact of the Uniates. Now, which also meant that most of Western Russia, almost all of Ukraine, Western Russia, Belarusia, were under the Polish-Latvian Empire, or Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and it was and there were brotherhoods, Orthodox brotherhoods, which grew up to try and defend Orthodoxy. Now, in the 17th century, one of the major leaders was Peter Mogila, who was the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev, and he opened the first theological school in Russia, patterned, of course, on a Western seminary, and of course teaching all in Latin. And there were certain very problematic things that crept into his practice, and so and these became the tradition in the Russian Orthodox Church. And if you want to see them, open up a Rokor service book.
Oh no.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to compare a contemporary Jordanville service book with an Old Believer service book, which doesn't have these Peter Mogila additions, but rather reflects its own kind of unique practice. And so things can be very interesting sometimes. There can be all sorts of discussions, even at the altar, as to whether a certain practice is appropriate or not. So in other words, this whole period, the 17th century, 18th century, you had these. The struggle with the Uniates in the 17th century. You had this the Old Believer Schism in the 17th century. Then at the end of the 18th century, you had the introduction, or you had the translation and publication of the Philokalia into Russian, into Slavonic, and then eventually into Russian, and that. Essentially, it called back the church to its, patristic sources, whereas whereas so much of what had been going on were the contemporary controversies of the 18th and 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. So going from, as if you're an old believer, you cross yourself like that, as opposed to like this, to whether you give the Peter Mogila thing, do you commune the deacon of the chalice at the pre-sanctified liturgy, and why, or why not? That's a big Peter Mogila thing. There's all sorts of other practices that became embedded in the Russian tradition, which were accepted rather unquestioningly. It's only now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, that people are bringing a more critical approach to looking at our service books, to looking at how things are done, and to looking at how to structure monasticism. Of course, in the Soviet period, what was left of monasticism was basically obliterated. Most of the monks were shot. Those that weren't shot were sent to the Gulag. But it was out of the gulags that the new flowering of monasticism happened. But it reflects the better tradition, the more ancient patristic tradition of the Philokalia, as opposed to the Latinized, Peter Mogila-ized tradition coming out of the 17th and 18th centuries. Does this make sense? Yeah.
So you were saying something about idiorhythmia.
Idiorhythmia, yeah.
Can you get back to that?
Idiorhythmia.
I lost the...
yeah, okay, no, that's good. In an idiorhythmic monastery, it's basically a bunch of guys living together with services. So each one has their own income. Each one has their own little apartment. Each one eats their own meals at their own times, and they come together and they'll do services together and things like that. When I first went to St. Pantaleimons on the Holy Mountain, it was back in 94. It was still idiorhythmic, and so I was shown to a beautiful suite of rooms, with a kitchen and the whole, a nice living room, beautifully furnished, 19th century kind of furniture, and with the other monks, because I was a hybrid deacon at the time, and so I thought, this is interesting, but there was no sense of community, and so in church, and this was really funny, you had two cleroses. You had the old guys, who couldn't sing. They sang like frogs. They were, you couldn't understand what they were saying. But they knew the services. And then you had this group of young guys, right out of Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, sent down there to help revive the monastery, and they sang like angels. But if one of them made a mistake, much less stole a line from the other side, one of the old guys would holler out in church, "You idiot! What are you doing? Don't you know how the services are supposed to go? You're off key. Stop it! And this is the middle of a Vespers or whatever."
Where was that?
St. Pantaleimons on the Holy Mountain.
Oh, in the Holy Mountain.
Burak. I'll never forget hearing that in church. Which means idiot. So see how the brethren love one another. It was only later that St. Panteleimon was able to really pull itself together once they allowed more, the Greeks allowed more Russians to come and form, and build the monastic community, so that the old guys were taken care of and the young guys could take over and do the work that was needed. But in the 1970s, by the 1970s, the entire Holy Mountain had gone to idiorhythmic. It was, except for the skeets. And it was from the skeets, like Elder Joseph the Hezekiah, St. Joseph now, and he refounded 5 communities. Elder Amelia Nos came from Meteora. The elder who refounded Vasilios was a theology professor from Thessalonica, and he refounded and Stavronikita and Ibiran. So, gradually the Holy Mountain was put back together, but it's young. It's young.
And what was the violence to the Holy Mountain of the tradition?
The violence?
I mean, what happened?
Well, basically, during the Soviet era, and World War I and World War II, and the Soviet takeover in Russia, and then the communist takeover in all of Eastern Europe, and the total political chaos in Greece. Nobody went. No, there were no novices on the Holy Mountain. There's a story. There's an elder that I knew, Father Avel. I met him when he was the abbot of Monastery of St. John the Theologian in Ryazan, outside of Moscow. And he had been the abbot of St. Panteleimon in the 70s. And he had been, he was a priest monk, but he was a parish priest. Somehow in the Soviet period. And he got a blessing to go to the Holy Mountain for a pilgrimage. And the abbot came up to him and said, "Welcome. It's wonderful to have you, a priest monk. How would you like to be the abbot?" And he took off his cross and put it on him and said, "You're now the abbot. I'm going away. Bye." And he did. He fled. And so here was this parish priest, who found himself the abbot of one of the great monasteries of the Holy Mountain. In other words, he inherited a ruin with a bunch of crusty old guys who fought with
Probably
one
a lot
another.
of politics.
Yeah, it was awful, but still holy. So monasticism has had its ups and downs, and the whole concept of obedience is essential and foundational to what monasticism is all about. In idiorhythmic monasticism, there is no obedience. You may have a spiritual father who may tell you to do these canons, do this, so many prostrations, and whatever. But that's kind of as far as it goes. And or there may be a list of chores that need to be done, and somebody assigns the chores. That's a long way. That's a long, long way from this kind of obedience, right? This kind of obedience doesn't exist anymore because it's too radical, and it's too radical because Westernized people are too immature to deal with it.
What about for a wife to her husband, especially maybe a Presbyterian?
that's a very important thing. But in any marriage, there's mutual obedience. There's great mutuality. You know, it says that the husband is to love his wife, and the wife is to respect her husband. But and there has to be headship in the household, and that belongs to the husband. But that doesn't mean that that he can lord it over her and or try and control her or anything else. It means that there has to be what it means is they have to both be obedient to the gospel. And the obedience that's manifest in a marriage is what normal Orthodox obedience is all about. Cooperation or synergy out of love and respect. That's what obedience is. Synergy. It's about cooperation. And that synergy has to happen in a marriage for a marriage to work. That synergy has to happen in a monastery for a monastery to work. If it's some kind of military thing where you better obey or else, then that's an abuse.
Well, that's an abuse even wherever you see obedience,
Yeah.
Even in the monastic system.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
if it's based on love, whether it's monastic or if it's in the marriage context, could it not exist possibly still in this world in the marriage context?
Well, but it's not control.
Right.
It's not control. And there has to be that love, and there has to be the respect, and then the synergy works. And as long as if the husband is supported in his role by his wife, which is really incredibly important, then it will work. If the wife does not support his headship, then the whole system gets torn apart. But I really think that's how we should understand that. Because actually, what you don't see, one of the obverse sides of the whole obedience thing in here is the obedience of the novice supports the headship and the leadership of the elder. And the obedience of the novice is the synergy with the elder. It's a cooperation out of love and respect. And so both grow as a result of that relationship. Conversely, if the novice is judging and criticizing and doesn't trust the elder, then that undermines not only the elder's authority, but that undermines the relationship of love and respect between the two of them. And so that doesn't work. So it's a matter of mutual love, mutual respect, mutual trust, mutual cooperation, which is the nature of synergy, which is the nature of obedience in the church. And that kind of obedience, whether it's the unquestioning obedience or the kind of obedience we'll hear about from Saint Ignaty Brianchaninov, which is modified advice as opposed to unthinking obedience. It's that relationship of discipleship, which is communion in love and respect, so that the whole body, of which the relationship of elder and disciple is only one aspect, because there are probably many disciples of the one elder, so that the whole body is working together in synergy. Just like a family. Because the kids have to be if the kids are obedient to their parents, which is the essence of what a child is supposed to do, of what it means to be a Christian, a child, then the whole family is working together in synergy, love and respect. But if the kid is disobedient and rude and nasty, and then the whole system breaks down. So, you want to read chapter 12?
Yeah. What has been said of solitude and reclusion must also be said of obedience to elders in the form in which it was practiced in ancient monasticism. Such obedience is not given to our time. Saint Cassian of Rome says that the Egyptian fathers, among whom monasticism especially flourished and produced astonishing fruits, affirm that it is good to give spiritual direction and to be directed by those who are really wise, and they state that this is a very great gift and grace of the Holy Spirit. An indispensable condition of such submission is a spirit-bearing guide who by the will of the Spirit can mortify the fallen will of the person subject to him in the Lord, and can mortify all the passions as well. Man's fall and corrupt will implies a tendency to all the passions. It is obvious that the mortification of a fallen will, which is effected so sublimely and victoriously by the will of the Spirit of God, cannot be accomplished by a director's fallen will when the director himself is still enslaved to the passions. If you wish to renounce the world and learn the life of the gospel, said Saint Simeon, the new theologian, to the monks of his time, do not surrender or entrust yourself to an inexperienced or passionate master, lest instead of the life of the gospel you learn a diabolic life. For the teaching of good teachers is good, while the teaching of bad teachers is bad. Bad seeds invariably produce bad fruits. Every blind man who undertakes to guide others is a deceiver or quack, and those who follow him are cast into the pit of destruction according to the word of the Lord. If a blind man leads a blind man, both will fall into a pit. Those elders who take upon themselves the role, we use this unpleasant word, which properly belongs to the language of the world, in order to explain more exactly a matter which is essentially nothing less than soul-destroying acting and the most deplorable comedy. Elders who take upon themselves the role of the ancient holy elders without having their spiritual gifts should know that their very intention, their very thoughts and ideas concerning the great monastic activity of obedience are false. Let them know that their very outlook or way of thinking, their reasoning or understanding, and their knowledge are self-deception and diabolic delusion which cannot fail to give birth to a corresponding fruit in the person guided by them. Their wrong and defective attitude can only for a time remain unnoticed by the inexperienced beginner under their direction. If this beginner has but a little understanding and occupies himself with holy reading with the pure intention of finding salvation, in due time it is bound to be discovered, and this unpleasant discovery will lead to a most unpleasant separation, to most unpleasant relations between the elder and his disciple, and to the spiritual derangement and confusion of both. It is a terrible distress out of self-opinion and on one's own authority to take upon oneself duties which can be carried out only by the order of the Holy Spirit and by the action of the Spirit. It is a terrible thing to pretend to be a vessel of the Holy Spirit when all the while relations with Satan have not been broken and the vessel is still being defiled by the action of Satan. It is disastrous both for oneself and one's neighbor. It is criminal in God's sight, blasphemous. It will be useless to point out to us that Saint Zachariah, who was living in obedience to an inexperienced elder, his natural father Carion, attained to monastic perfection, or that Saint Acacius found salvation while living with a cruel elder who drove his disciple with inhuman floggings to an untimely grave. Both were in obedience to incompetent elders, but they were guided by the Spirit. They were guided by the counsels of spirit-bearing fathers and the most edifying examples which were in abundance before their eyes. Therefore, they could only have remained in outward obedience to their elders. These cases are outside the general rule and order. The mode of action is divine providence, said Saint Isaac the Syrian. The mode of action of divine providence, said Saint Isaac the Syrian, is completely different from the common human order. You should keep the common order. Perhaps you retort, a novice's faith can take the place of an incompetent elder. This is untrue. Faith in the truth saves. Faith in a lie and in diabolic delusion is ruinous, according to the teaching of the apostle. They refuse to love the truth that would save them, he says, of those who are voluntarily perishing. Therefore, God will permit them to suffer a strong delusion, so that they will believe a lie, that all may be condemned who do not believe the truth but delight in falsehood. Let it be to you according to your faith, said the Lord, the truth itself, to two blind men, and he healed them of their blindness. Falsehood and hypocrisy has not the right to repeat the words of truth itself for the justification of its criminal conduct, whereby liars and hypocrites subvert their neighbors. There have been instances, they are very, very rare, when faith, by the special providence of God, has operated through sinners and achieved the salvation of these sinners. In Egypt, the robber chief Flavian, intending to rob a certain women's convent, put on the monastic habit and went to the convent. The nuns took him for one of the Holy Fathers, conducted him to the church, and asked him to offer prayers for them to God, which Flavian did against his will and to his own amazement. Then food was set before him. After finishing his meal, the nuns washed his feet. In the convent, one of the sisters was blind and deaf. The nuns brought her and gave her some of the water to drink with which the stranger's feet had been washed. The patient was immediately healed. The nuns glorified God and the holy life of the strange monk, and they spread the news of the miracle that had taken place. The grace of God descended upon the robber chief. He offered repentance and was changed from a chief of robbers into a renowned father. In the life of Saint Theodore, Bishop of Edessa, we read that a harlot, forced by her desperate partner Adder, offered a prayer to God for her dead son, and that the child arose at the harlot's prayer. Terrified at what had happened, the harlot at once left her sinful life, entered a monastery, and by an ascetic life attained to holiness. Instances of this kind are exceptions. As we contemplate them, we shall act correctly if we wonder at the ways of providence and the inscrutable judgments of God, and are strengthened in faith and hope. We shall act very wrongly if we take these instances as models for imitation. As our guide to conduct, we have been given by God himself the law of God. That is to say, Holy Scripture and the writings of the Fathers. The Apostle Paul says decisively, "We command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to separate yourselves from every brother whose conduct is disorderly and not in accordance with the tradition you have received from us." By a tradition here is meant the moral tradition of the Church. It is expounded in sacred Scripture and in the writings of the Holy Fathers. Saint Pimen the Great offered that a penitent should immediately break with an elder if living with him proved to be harmful to the soul. Evidently, this meant that the elder in question was breaking the moral tradition of the Church. It is another matter when no harm is done to the soul, and one is only disturbed by thoughts. Disturbing thoughts are obviously diabolic. We must not yield to them. They operate just where we receive spiritual profit, which is what the demons want to snatch from us. Monastic obedience, in the form and character in which it was practiced by the monks of old, is a lofty spiritual mystery. Its attainment and full imitation has become impossible for us. We can only examine it reverently and intelligently, and appropriate its spirit. We show right judgment and evince salutary intelligence when, in reading about the rules and experiences of the ancient fathers and of their obedience, equally amazing both in the directors and in those who are being directed, we see at the present time a general decline of Christianity, and recognize that we are unfit to inherit the legacy of the fathers in its fullness and in all its abundance. It is a great mystery of God, a great blessing for us, that it is left to us to feed on the crumbs that fall from the spiritual tables of the fathers. These crumbs are not the most satisfying food, but they can prevent spiritual death, though not without a feeling of need and hunger and nostalgia.
That was through 12, right?
Yeah. Sorry if you didn't want me to close that.
Okay, so are there any questions on that?
Just the context where the author is coming from, his background, because this is a very serious view of our present state.
Yeah.
So his perspective, how do we?
Saint Ignaty was had been bishop of the Caucasus, and retired after just a few years, and retired to a monastery and became the overseer, the archimandrite for all the monasteries of the St. Petersburg region. And he spent the rest of his life working with monasticism and writing about it, and so he's recognized as one of the great Russian spiritual writers of the 19th century. He and Theophan the Recluse.
So then, though you mentioned some of the great monasteries, like in Kiev caves and others, they had a restoration.
Right.
Was he writing before that?
No, actually, he was he was writing to. He had both monasteries that had been restored, like Valon, and he's got some beautiful writings about Valon, as well as those that hadn't been. And so, because there were a lot of monasteries in the Kiev archdiocese, so he had to deal with everything.
And he didn't think it was even possible to be fully restored.
At this point, no. And I think most spiritual fathers will say the same thing today. Do you know Mother Michaela out in Safford?
I've seen her.
I've known her for years. She had a very interesting observation that of course it's a women's monastery. They've got like 25, 30 women there. For a girl who, say, is 20 years old, who was raised in a traditional Orthodox Christian home in the old country, in obedience to her parents, living a strict life of chastity and obedience to the commandments and seeking the will of God, and not totally isolated from the world, but living a very soundly Orthodox Christian life, as opposed to a 20-year-old girl who's just coming out of the world. She said there's at least a 7-year difference in maturity. So compared to the 20-year-old who'd been raised in a faithful Christian family, the other girl is about 14. And 14-year-olds have all sorts of issues, to say the least. But it's certainly the same thing with men, if not more so, if not more than 7 years.
But I don't understand your point.
Very few and far between are those who come to the monasteries in this country, and in the modern world. It's not just this country; it's all of Europe as well. All of Orthodox, of people who were stepped from a context of obedience to their parents to obedience in a monastery.
I see.
where it's just a natural transition. Instead of mom, it's the abbess, but same relationship basically. And in a men's monastery, it's more than 7 years.
I like when I forgot who with the Hermitage of the Holy Cross. I'll just ascribe it to our Commander Seraphim. But he said that they're not ascetics. They're just trying to be healed from modernity, basically, trying to become human beings, because we're just so broken by the times that we live in.
You know, in Manton, our basic vision was, we're not trying to be ascetic, we're trying to be Christians. We're just trying to be Christians and live together as Christians, as a community of Christians. So, baby steps. So we'll deal with this more next week. So, we'll cut it off here. It's an hour and a half anyway. So, okay. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption, that gave us birth to God the Word, true Theotokos, we magnify. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and to ages and ages. Amen. God bless you.